Shalom and welcome to the second video in our study series, Kings and Prophets, God Searches for Our Heart, Fully His, as we unpack how to live righteously in an unrighteous world. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe to my YouTube channel for notifications when all new videos are posted. And while you're there, check out all the other studies that are available. If you'd like to join us for a live study, PM me through Facebook Messenger and I'll send you a link and a password for our free Zoom classes held every Thursday from 6:30 to 8 o'clock Eastern Standard Time. Below this video is a link to the student pages for tonight's study. So if you'll turn in your Bibles to 1 Kings chapter 15, we'll get started with a real quick review of what we've learned so far. So far we've studied that there was a united kingdom of Israel. And under that united kingdom of Israel, we only had three kings. We had King Saul, then we had King David, and then we had King Solomon. Now it was divided in 931 BC between the northern kingdom, which kept the name Israel, and the southern kingdom, which took the name Judah. Now the northern kingdom, we've only studied one king, and that's Jeroboam. He had a really long reign. In the southern kingdom, we studied Rehoboam, Abijah, and Asa. And Asa was the only one that we're told had a heart that was wholly devoted to God. Now, because our study for tonight is in 1 Kings, and there are no parallel verses in 2 Chronicles, we know that we're going to be focusing on the northern kingdom. Because remember, 1 and 2 Chronicles were written probably by Ezra, and it was written for those Babylonian captivities who were coming back into the land, which would have been back into the southern kingdom. And so 2 Chronicles and 1 Chronicles were both written for those refugees or exiles as they were coming back home. So since we're in 1 Kings and not 2 Chronicles, we're going to focus tonight on the northern kingdom. So we're actually going to finish up chapter 15. We started chapter 15 last week. So 1 Kings chapter 15, beginning in verses 23 through 34. Now we kind of jump back and forth in time. Verse 24 is actually 870 BC. Now, in verse 25, we actually hit the rewind button and go back in time about 40 years to 910 BC. And we stay there until verse 33, when we're then in 909 BC. So if you look, who actually became king of the northern kingdom after Jeroboam? We're told it was his son Nadab. Now this happened in Asa's third year while Asa was ruling the southern kingdom. And he wasn't king for very long. Nadab only ruled for 2 years. And then after him came the king Basha. Now Basha was king for 24 years. And he wasn't Nadab's any kind of relative, actually. He became king because he assassinated Nadab. And then Basha decided he was going to reign in Tirzah. Now, Basha was from Issachar, where Jeroboam and Nadab were from the very big tribe and very strong tribe of Ephraim. Now, in verse 26, we hit a key phrase. And it really goes a lot further than he did evil in the sight of the Lord, which we're going to see all through 1 and 2 Kings. It goes a little farther because it adds, he did evil in the sight of the Lord and walked in the way of his father, who would have been Jeroboam, and in the sin which he made Israel sin. Now, evil is raw. It's the bad and the vicious disposition, but it can actually be in your thoughts or in your actions. So that sight, ayin, literally means the eye. So figuratively, though, it refers to the mental and your spiritual faculties, your mental and your spiritual state. And sin, your chatoah, that's your condition or the guilt of sin. Now, in verses 29 through 30, there's a prophecy. And this is what the prophecy says. The prophecy says it came about as soon as he was king. He struck down the household of Jeroboam. He didn't leave to Jeroboam any persons alive until he had destroyed them, according to the word of the Lord, which he spoke by his servants Ahijah the Shilonite, And because of the sins of Jeroboam, which he sinned, and which he made Israel sin, because of his provocation with which he provoked the Lord of Israel to anger. This goes back to 1 Kings 14, verses 4 through 11, when Jeroboam's son was sick, and he sent his wife to the prophet. And the prophet said, your son is going to die. As soon as you, the mother, step foot into your town, your son's going to die. And your husband's family is going to be completely wiped out, whether they're a free man or whether they're a slave. It doesn't matter. And if they die out in the field, the birds are going to eat them. And if they die in the city, the dogs are going to eat them. And none of them will be buried. There will be no memorial for any of them. The only one who's going to be able to be buried was Jeroboam's son, who was sick. And we're told in Scripture that was because God actually found some good in him. So because of Jeroboam's sin of introducing idolatry, all of his descendants would be wiped out and no memorial would be set. This is actually a perfect example of corporate punishment for individual sin. Because unfortunately, unrighteousness is more contagious than righteousness. And even when people are following someone in unrighteousness, when that person turns and is convicted and goes back to God and God restores him, unfortunately, those who followed him in unrighteousness don't tend to now follow them into righteousness. They just continue on with their unrighteousness. So who carried out this judgment? Basha. And Basha says in verse 30, it says that it was because of the sins of Jeroboam and the provocation with which he provoked the Lord. Now, provocation is ka'ak. And it's something that either causes someone to be annoyed, or it's also the state of mind resulting from being annoyed. And that provocation and provoked and anger, it's all the exact same verse. Now, when we go down to chapter 16 of 1 Kings, the first 7 verses, these are about Basha. And we meet another prophet, and his name is Jehu. And Jehu's name means God is he. And the prophecy against Basha's family is pretty much exactly what God said would happen to Jeroboam's family. It said that they're going to be consumed. Now, Basha understood what it meant for his family to be utterly destroyed, because he's the one who utterly destroyed Jeroboam's house, including Nadab, who was the king. It's the only reason Basha was sitting on the throne right now. But look at why this judgment was going to come to his house. Not only because of the idolatry that he continued in the sins of Jeroboam, but also because he destroyed Jeroboam's lineage. Now that can be kind of confusing to us, because whose judgment was he enacting? I mean, he was enacting God's judgment. He was fulfilling God's prophecy. But now he's being punished for it. Why? That doesn't exactly seem right, and it doesn't exactly seem fair. But we're going to talk about that as we go down through this lesson. Doing what ends up fulfilling the will of God while we're acting outside of the will of God is still unrighteousness. So verses 8 through 20, it's about 886 BC. And now we have another king. And this king's name is Elah. And Elah means an oak. Now, Asa has been ruling the southern kingdom for 26 years before Elah ever becomes king in the northern kingdom. And he reigns from Tirzah, and he only reigns for 2 years. Because it's really odd what happens to Elah. A man named Zimri, whose name actually means my music, but he was the commander of half of the charioteers. He was very high up in the army, and he would have been very close to Elah and very, very trusted. He assassinated Elah. He assassinated the king. Why? To fulfill the prophecy of Jehu. But if you look, Zimri didn't last very long. He only lasted 7 7 days. That was it. Basha destroyed Jehu's entire line, and God didn't destroy his family for 24 years. Zimri destroyed Elah, destroyed the line of Basha, exactly what God said was going to happen, but he only lasted 7 days. How come he didn't get 24 years? How come he didn't even get 2 years? He didn't even get past 7 days. There came a man named Omri. And Omri was the army commander, and he actually conspired to kill Zimri. So Zimri runs off, and he runs back to Tirzah. Now, when he sees the army coming up against him, and all the people coming up against him, because they're really angry at him for killing Elah, Tirzah decided to take the coward's way out. He stayed inside the palace. He set the palace on fire, and as the palace burned down, he killed himself. And verse 19 tells us exactly why God judged Zimri. And in verse 19 of chapter 16, it says, because the sins which he sinned, doing evil in the sight of the Lord, walking in the way of Jeroboam, and his sin which he did, making Israel sin. Zimri was king for 7 days. You have to think, how much farther into sin could Zimri have led the northern kingdom in only 7 days? But what I find even more interesting is that Jeroboam's only real legacy is the sin that he committed and the sin in which he made Israel sin. How would you like that to be your legacy? Not what kind of king you were, not how many battles you won, not how prosperous you made the country, not for the little while or long term that you were at peace, but the only thing people remember you for is the sin for which you caused Israel to sin. Going on, starting in verse 21, the divided kingdom becomes divided again. Because now there are two sides kind of vying for the northern kingdom. Omri and a man named Tibni. Now eventually in 881, Omri does become king. So we know this wasn't like a quick thing or a really fast civil war, or, Tibni just kind of died and Omri took over. I mean, Omri became king in 885. So this took about 4 years of a lot of civil war and a lot of back and forthing before a true king was actually named. Now, we don't know how Tibni eventually died. We don't know if he just died and so his side didn't have a leader, or whether he was killed by some of Omri's followers, whether Omri sent someone to kill him. We're never told. We just know that Omri himself did not assassinate or did not kill Tibni. So now Omri is officially the king of the northern kingdom. And he actually reigned for 12 years. 6 of those years he reigned in Tirzah. And 6 of those years he reigned in Shamron, or Samaria. It means a watch mountain. And that is when it became the official capital of the northern kingdom. And Shamron, Samaria, actually still exists today, right where it was back in the day when Omri actually bought it. And then we're told, go figure, Omri was evil in the sight of the Lord. So then the very next king, starting in verse 29 of the northern kingdom, was Ahab. And Ahab reigned for 22 years. He was crowned king of the northern kingdom in 874 BC. And he's described as being more evil than all of those before him. And look in verse 31. And see how Scripture divides Ahab's decision to marry the Sidonian Jezebel, whose name actually means Baal is my husband. Look in verse 31 of chapter 16. It says, it came about as though it had been a trivial thing for him to walk in the sins of Jeroboam the son of Nebat, that he married Jezebel. And he went on to serve Baal, and he worshipped him. That trivial is a kalal. It's of little action. It didn't take very much. It didn't take any thought. It was no big deal to Ahab to marry a Sidonian Jezebel and then not only take her as his wife, but to also take her false gods, her idol gods, her pagan gods, Baal and Asherah, as his own gods, because it says he did indeed worship them. Now, by the time Ahab had become king, the kingdom had been divided about 57 years, and it really followed a very slow fade. 60 years before Ahab was king, there was a united kingdom. It was prosperous and it was at peace. 57 years before Ahab became king, 2 golden calves were built, one in Dan up north and one in Bethel in the south, and a very divergent priesthood and religious system was established. 57 years, and they're on their 7th king. They're at war constantly. They've never been at peace. Now the king is living in a second capital city, and an altar and a sanctuary for Baal and Asherah are in Samaria, built and worshipped by the king. Now, 57 years ago from today, it was 1964. Johnson, at the time, President Johnson sent 5,000 troops into Vietnam. It raised our presence to 21,000. Cassius Clay actually changed his name to Muhammad Ali. The 24th Amendment ensuring fair voting practices was enacted, and now look back to 2020. Race riots broke out, and Johnson actually signed the Civil Rights Act into law, but look where we are 57 years later. Jeff Bezos, the founder of Amazon, is born, and look what Amazon is now part of the 2021 cancer culture. The Beatles came to America bringing rock and roll. And actually 2 years earlier, in 1962, prayer was removed from schools by the U.S. Supreme Court. And how far has our education system faded since then? Now in verse 34 of chapter 16, we get a verse that just seems to come out of absolutely nowhere. It seems totally unrelated. It seems totally out of context. And it's one of those verses that just kind of comes and it goes, and there's really no rhyme or reason that it seems like it's even there. But let's look back and let's turn to the book of Joshua. Chapter 6, verse 26. And this is what it says. Then Joshua made them, that's the people of Israel, take an oath at that time, saying, Cursed before the Lord is the man who rises up and builds this city Jericho. With the loss of his firstborn he shall lay its foundations, and with the loss of his youngest he shall set up his gates. Now let's turn to 1 Kings chapter 16, verse 34. In his days, Hiel the Bethelite built Jericho. He laid its foundations with the loss of Abiram, his firstborn, and set up its gates with the loss of his youngest son, Segub, according to the word of the Lord, which he spoke by Joshua the son of Nun. So as Hiel was building up Jericho, when he set the foundations, his oldest son died. And when he set its gates, his youngest son died. So we don't, the Battle of Jericho of Joshua 6:26, somewhere around 1400 BC. Now Ahab was king from 874 to 852. We don't know exactly when verse 34 occurred in all of this. But what we do know is that verse 34 occurred somewhere between 526 and 548 years after God declared that if anybody tried to build Jericho, his firstborn and his lastborn would die. So what is the actual point of this verse? It's really simple. What God says with his mouth, he will accomplish by his hand. God's blessings and God's curses do not have an expiration date. You have to remember, time means nothing to God. He has eternity to accomplish his will. So then we move on to chapter 17 of 1 Kings. And we meet another prophet. We meet lots of new people in chapters 15 through 18. So in verse 17, we meet Elijah. Eliyahu means God is my God. And he had a prophecy for Ahab. It said it's not going to rain. For all these years, until I say so, it's not going to rain. Now in these verses, it doesn't tell us how long it doesn't rain, but we know further in Scripture, it tells us it doesn't rain for 3 years and 6 months. So for 3.5 years. And if you want some cross-references for that, you can look in Deuteronomy chapter 11, verses 13 through 17, Deuteronomy chapter 28, verses 23 through 24, and Leviticus 26, verses 18 through 20. And what all of these cross-references say, it's God saying, you know what, if you disobey me, if you become deceived in your hearts, if you turn away from God, if you serve and worship other gods, then I will withhold the rain. Elijah obeyed God. Elijah went to the king in absolute faith and said, it will not rain until I say it will rain. But as soon as he said it, he needed to go hide. So he went to Harit, which is just east of Jordan. And ravens came and actually brought him food, and he was able to drink from the brook that was there at Harit until, because of the famine, it completely dried up. And when it completely dried up, in verse 8, we're told God told Elijah to go look for a widow in a place called Zarephath, who'd already actually been instructed by God to take care of Elijah. But she had her own quandary. She had her own issues going on because she barely had enough to make one more meal. She said, I got enough oil, enough flour. I'm going to make my son and I one more small piece of bread, and then we're just going to get ready to starve to death. But Elijah told her if she would provide for him, her oil and her flour would never run out. She provided in faith, again, for Elijah, and her oil and her flour never ran out for years. It never ran out. But then she had a second quandary. Her son died. And she called Elijah back. And Elijah went to his room and spread himself out over the boy 3 times. And he prayed for God to heal him. And God did. And so look at the woman's declaration. She said, I know you are a man of God, and the words out of your mouth are true. In essence, she's saying, I know you're a man of God, and I know that you are God's Navi. You are God's prophet. You're God's spokesperson, because what you say is true. Now, working on down through 1 Kings 18. Now we're about in 871 BC, and we meet another guy. We meet a guy named Obadiah. And Obadiah means he's a servant of God. Now, Obadiah is a God-fearer. We're told he fears God. And Ahab tells Obadiah to go and we need to survey the land for whatever grass we can find so that we can actually feed the cattle and the horses so that they don't have to be killed. Now I'm thinking if I'm in the middle of the famine and I'm about to starve to death, I'm going to be eating some horses and some cows. But instead, Ahab wanted to save them. So he said, I'll go over here and you go over there and we'll go look for some grass. Now, part of Obadiah being a man who feared God, he was in awe, he honored, he respected God. He actually also stepped out in faith. Because when Jezebel was hunting down and killing all the prophets, destroying them, eliminating them, Obadiah actually saved 100 of them. He put 50 of them in one cave and 50 of them in another cave, and not only did he hide them out, he fed them and gave them water. Now that in itself is a miracle, because how in the world are you going to sneak out of the king's palace enough food and water for 100 people on a really good day, let alone for 100 people in the middle of a drought and a famine? Sneaking a little for yourself, sneaking a little bit for this person, one or two might be easy. But 100 people, and he never got caught. Not carrying it out. It was never missed. Miracle of God. When you step out in faith and obedience to God, God's blessings follow. So while Obadiah was out surveying his side of the land, he just so happened to meet Elijah. And Obadiah is told to go to Ahab and say, Elijah's here. Now it tells us that Obadiah recognized Elijah. He knew exactly who Elijah was. And he actually called him master. And you can follow on down through there the same word. We see that in verse 7, in verse 8, verse 11, verse 13, and verse 14. Your master, my master. The master is the exact same word. And that word for master is Adon. It means a master, a king, a lord. It can refer to a person, or it can even refer to God. One of the names of God is Adonai, which means my master. But see, Obadiah then has kind of a quandary of faith, because he says, listen, I'm afraid that as soon as I leave to go tell Ahab that, hey, I found Elijah, because you know he's looking for you. I found him. God's going to take you away, and by the time I get back here with Ahab, you're going to be gone. And so Ahab's going to kill me because I lied. But Obadiah goes and he tells Ahab. And when Ahab sees Elijah, finally found Elijah, he calls him a troubler of Israel. Now the troubler is an akar. It's somebody who stirs up a lot of trouble, or who stirs up a big disturbance. But Elijah hadn't even begun to stir up some disturbances in Israel. Because then Elijah tells Ahab, you know what? You need to gather up all the people. We're going to go meet on Mount Carmel. Now what I think is funny is that this hunted fugitive is now giving orders to the king, and the king is actually obeying them. So he went and gathered all the people. They all met on Mount Carmel. And look at what the prophet said. Elijah came near all the people and said, how long will you hesitate between two opinions? If the Lord is God, follow him. But if Baal, follow him. But the people didn't answer him. Now that hesitate is Pesach. It's where we get our word Passover. It means to pass over, to skip, to limp. And the opinions is ka'apa, which is actually like a branch, like a tree branch. And what it's saying is, how long are you going to keep passing over this branch? In our modern vernacular, we say, how long are you going to keep straddling the fence? If God is God, worship him. If Baal is God, then worship him. But quit straddling the fence. Quit hesitating between two opinions. So, we look at four things. First, we're going to look at what the prophets of Baal did, because they actually got to go first. Elijah was a gentleman. They sacrificed the bull, and they called out to Baal. Nobody answered. Then they decided they were going to ramp it up a little bit. And they jumped on top of the altar. And they got loud. No answer. So then after some prompting, or taunting really, from Elijah, they decided to yell louder. And then they started cutting themselves until it says the blood just ran. And no answer. And then it said they raved, they nabah, they prophesied. And there was no answer. Now you got to picture this in your mind. There's 850 prophets, 450 prophets of Baal, 400 prophets of Asherah. They're cutting themselves. The blood is flowing. They're jumping on the altar. There's this dead bull. He's been there all day. It's got to start stinking. They're screaming. They're prophesying. They're whatever they do. And then nobody answers. Where's their God? And then here's what Elijah did. In the evening time, he got the people to come in a little closer. Then it says he repaired the altar of God that had been torn down. And he placed 12 stones for the 12 tribes of the united Israel. And then he dug a trench around it, big enough to actually hold about 5.5 gallons of seeds. He dumped 4 buckets 3 times over the wood and into the trench. 4 times 3, 12. And then look what happened in verse 36 and 37. It says, at the time of the offering of the evening sacrifice, Elijah the prophet said, O Lord, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, today let it be known that you are God in Israel, and I am your servant, and I have done all these things at your word. Answer me, Lord, answer me, that these people will know that you, O Lord, are God, and that you have turned their hearts back to them. He asked God to anah, to speak, to respond to me, to testify, so that these people will yada. These people will recognize and acknowledge and confess that you are God in Israel. And so what did God do? He sent a fire. Now fire represents judgment, and it represents his wrath, and it consumed or devoured the entire offering. And so then what did the people do? What was their response? Their confession was Adonai hu Elohim, the Lord, he is God. They gathered up the prophets of Baal. They dragged them down to the Kishon Brook, and every one of them was slaughtered. In verse 41, Elijah then went to Ahab and said, the rain is coming. What was the difference between then and 3.5 years earlier? The condition of the people's hearts, even if momentarily, went back to God, and their confession became Hu Adonai hu Elohim, God is God. Ahab then acted on faith. He believed there was no rain, that no rain would come when he told Ahab it wouldn't. Then he acted in faith again, believing God would now send the rain. So he went and he sat up on the mountain, and he sent his servant 7 times, the number of perfection, to go look out over the sea to see if he could see the clouds rolling in. 6 times he saw nothing. The 7th time, there was a little tiny cloud in the sky. So Elijah got up, and he told Ahab that he better start taking cover because a storm was a-coming. And Ahab rode his chariot to Jezreel, which is near Mount Gilboa in ancient Issachar. And it said God strengthened Ahab, and he was able to outrun Ahab's horse, so that he actually arrived in Jezreel first. Now, one of the ladies who takes class in person with us on Thursdays said that it was very common practice for a runner to run in front of the king's chariot. And Ahab, an old guy, was the one who ran in front of Ahab's horse and chariot. And he actually arrived in Jezreel first. Now that kind of makes my mind, for those of you who have been studying, know that my mind goes to really crazy places. Why didn't Ahab just run him over and be done with him? I mean, he's going to where his wife is. He's going to Jezreel. Jezebel is in Jezreel, and he's about to have to tell her that every one of her prophets, 850 of them, were just slaughtered by the guy, who's been running in front of my horse for the last 15 to 20 miles, and I did nothing to him. I allowed him to come into our town. But he didn't. It says God strengthened strengthened Elijah to be able to run for 15 to 20 miles into Jezreel and get there first. So what does this mean? What application could these verses, these chapters that we've studied have for our life? Well, are there areas in your life that you're actually hesitating between two opinions? As a believer, you have a relationship with an omniscient, all-knowing God. So why not ask him what his opinion is? Because either God is God, deserving of hearts that are fully his, or the world is your God and your heart belongs fully to it. When Basha and Ahab destroyed each other's families, fulfilling God's prophecies, they weren't acting in the will of God, but to fulfill their own desires and their own selfish motives. So there are areas in your life where you're acting presumptuously, where you're claiming to do the work of God in the name of God, but you are not within the will of God. God knows your hearts, and God knows your motives. So thank you for joining me in our study tonight. If you're studying with us and you don't have a book, you can prepare for next week's lesson by reading 1 Kings chapters 19 through 21. So until next time, Shavua Tov, have a great week. Shalom, shalom.